From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And ahead today, K-State's Gregg Ibendahl will discuss the new set of K-State crop budgets that will be available later this week for you producers as you plan your 2022 crop production. He'll talk about how those budget numbers will serve as a guide to the likelihood of profitability for a given crop, broken down by region of the state. Also, from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen is back, this time to talk about the farm tax rules applying to prepaid expenses and what is and isn't considered a legitimate end-of-year prepaid expenditure. And later, K-State's Gus Hoeven checks in with another Stop, Look, and Listen, here on this Agriculture Today. It's good to have you aboard once more for another Agriculture Today. Well, word out of the Agricultural Economics Department this week that the annual series of crop production budgets for you Kansas producers is now coming together and will be available to you for 2022 production considerations. A great lot of work goes into these, of course, and one of the principals involved in that is with us now, agricultural economist Gregg Ibendahl of K-State Research and Extension. Massive information here, Greg, in all of these budgets. We won't cover it all, but this series has been going on for a while, and it's intended to give producers a ballpark idea of the costs and returns to crop production. What?
Yeah, there's several things we're trying to cover. So we're trying to cover all the major crops as well as some of the more or less common crops. And we try to cover our budget usually for the major crop growing regions in the state. We divide our state into 6 regions and usually try to produce a budget for each one of those. So within that, we end up with about 60 or 70 different budgets. We have the regular dry land, non-irrigated stuff, as well as we produce a series of irrigated budgets. We've kind of expanded our irrigated budgets this year to include, the 4 regions, the 2 out west, 2 in the central part of the state that would have a lot of the irrigation, so we incorporate that. But really what we're trying to do here is give producers an idea of really the relative profitability of looking at crops like, what is the cost that's going to grow soybeans this year versus corn. The budgets are really a forward planning tool. They're not a tool to go back and look at historical numbers as such because a lot of things have changed in the past year. The example was when we put the budgets together last year, we had a set of grain prices that turned out to be way, way low. So really comparing a new budget to an old budget really isn't very much of a good exercise. But if you do go through, it is really good for looking at what's the cost protection this year and where am I going to have to spend my money to get my crops grown.
Some background here, though, how you arrive at this data. What sources do you tap into to plug all of these numbers in?
Well, we kind of develop our budget basically from a way you would look at actually growing the crop. So we look at all the field operations that would go into growing the crop. We look at what herbicides and insecticides you would have to spray. We look at the set of machinery that you would use, the chemicals that you're spraying. And then we kind of build it up basically from a pass-by-pass operation through the field. So we look at all those. Then we have a big database of background information. I depend on a lot of my colleagues here at K-State to supply me with those. So we look at the fertilizer prices. I'm getting those from DTN and some other sources like those. The herbicide costs come from the work the agronomy folks put together every year for prices for that. I depend on Dan O'Brien to give me the grain prices. So all those things tied together. I have a tool out there I'm going to release to producers this year that you can actually look at the tool I use to put these things together. But what it does, it takes the field operations that I've put in and the equipment sizes, and it goes back and matches those back up with our back-end databases of all those kind of raw costs that we have.
Highly detailed these are, and there are budgets for corn, soybeans, alfalfa, cotton, grain sorghum, wheat, of course, sunflowers, forage sorghum, broken down by regions. And when you go at this and you consider what we've been discussing at length of late, the expected higher costs of inputs, fertilizer, herbicides, chemicals of all kinds. Did you incorporate that element into these?
Well, I did as best I could. So, I have fairly recent numbers for fertilizer and such, but now I'm even wondering now if that is going to be too low, because I think we're in such a state of transition right now with prices and inflation that's really hard to pin those down. So one idea Dan and I had going forward in this year is we're going to provide our base set of budgets now, at the first part of November, but going forward through the year, we're going to kind of update at least the general summaries of the expense categories to incorporate prices as they change. I already think my price of fertilizer may be too low, because I've heard a lot of reports of anhydrous being well over $1,000 a ton. I'm not sure I quite made $1,000 a ton for my price I put in there. So things like that are going to have to be adjusted as I go forward. Really, all the inputs, I think, if inflation stays at the current level, are probably going to need to be adjusted. So I think this idea of maybe doing some monthly updates to the budgets, I think, is going to be useful to a lot of folks.
Oh, we look forward to those. But just basically here, if a producer opens up one of these, what will they find? Breakdown of expected direct expenses, fixed expenses, and so on.
So we're going to have really like a couple forms of this. We're going to have just a printed version, which is just going to be a set of PDF versions of the budget. We're also going to have an Excel tool, and then I'm also going to release my budget generator tool, which is really a standalone application that you can run on a Windows computer. But if you just pull up the PDF version, we really have three versions of a budget. We have a very short version, which I'm calling kind of a budget abstract. It's really just a half-page total. It has all the expense items, but at a very summarized level. So when I have a number then for fertilizer, I'll just have the number for fertilizer. I don't have all the components that go into that. The next level down would be more of an executive summary. That's usually about a page for most of the budgets like that. It has a slightly more level of detail. So it would have the fertilizer line, but in addition to that, it would have like the NP and K amounts that go into a budget. So that would be the next level of detail. The final level of detail is for someone who really wants to get into the weeds and looks at everything that go into that. So not only would we have the level of fertilizer and nitrogen, but we would also say the type of product where we either use anhydrous or urea or MAP or something like that. And that would also extend down to the machinery. We have the specific machine size and such that go into that. Those kind of budgets, then it'll give you the same bottom line. It won't be any different in that regard, but you'll see all where every penny of your budget dollar goes. And those budgets turn out to be probably about 2 or 3 pages long. So altogether, there's going to be 3 different lengths of budget versions. They all have the same bottom line number. It really just depends on how much detail you want to get out of all this.
And you account for labor costs as well.
Yeah, we have all the expenses that would change based on the level of production, which we call direct expenses, and those would be your out-of-pocket expenses, whether you grow the crop, if you actually grow the crop. And then we have the fixed expenses, which would be things like cash rent and all the machinery items that you'd have to pay whether or not you grew a crop or not, like that. So we're really covering the full cost of production in all these budgets.
Are there any specific changes beyond what we've talked about so far that you've included in this year's budgets that weren't there in the past then, Greg?
Well, we've had some discussion with our agronomy folks about the best way to say what our information should be. So we're looking at this more of a planning tool and maybe what the better producers will be using. So because of that, we probably have changed most of the equipment mix in our budgets to reflect the fact that we are using bigger equipment. I mean, out west, we're using almost all the combines, or we're assuming like a 12-row corn head and stuff like that, which may not be the case across the rest of the state or whatever. So we're assuming fairly good-sized equipment. We're assuming you get things in a timely fashion. Our yield goals are probably a little higher than what the county average would be. So we're like for sorghum especially, you'll see that stand out. So our sorghum yield is something that you could actually get and achieve if you would plant sorghum on some of your best ground. But it certainly is not the case. Well, a lot of producers approach grain sorghum, and a lot of that's kind of maybe on some of the less better grounds. So the yields tend to be probably a little bit lower on average. So we're looking at really planning what you could do in a good situation as a way for producers to make planning decisions going forward.
All right, then. Well, producers individually need to punch in their own numbers and to work through these tools that you put together aligned with these budgets. But your general observations, if you might, Greg, on the profitability expectations for our major crops here in Kansas in 2022. How is it looking?
Well, again, if you compare it with last year, which I recommend not doing because we had so low grain prices, profitability still looks pretty good going into 2022. But you got to keep in mind here, there are a lot of higher expenses this year than what there was last year. In a lot of cases, we're showing a cost, in the mid $10 range to grow soybeans. So it's a good thing we have soybean prices in the low $11 range to still show a profit. So what I'm really concerned about going forward is the fact that what if our grain prices don't pan out like what we're saying about? You got a lot of expenses you've already got in the ground here, so we're saying it could be a good year. But, if things would turn south a little bit, you have a lot of things locked up in higher expenses that you suddenly may not realize. So, the cost of farming just got a lot more expenses this last year, I guess is the best way to say that.
Right. And we're looking at 2022 as being a formidable year in that respect as well. So these budgets, again, will be posted quite soon for producers to glance over and to utilize through the interactive tools.
Yes, all those tools should be posted here very soon.
That'll be on agmanager.info. Again, that's agmanager.info. And just as a parting thought, having mentioned that expenses will be likely higher, hopefully prices will hold up, what are you suggesting to producers as you meet with them here heading into the wintertime about management to assure that they maximize their profitability?
Okay, that's a good question because, I think what I've been forecasting for net farm income for this year is we're probably looking at probably a record net farm income for the state, which is going to be a big drop-off for next year. Well, so, typically what farmers like to do when they have really good years for net farm income is they like to plow some of that money back into equipment just to help lower their taxable income, which I think is a good strategy in a lot of years. That may not be the case going forward here. I think with the fact that we may not be looking at a new inflated level of expenses, and I'm not sure what may happen with grain prices, maybe farmers ought to be a little more cautious with that extra money they're going to have this year and kind of sock that away for a rainy day, which may be coming up, down the road as far as grain prices are concerned.
2022 crop budgets for Kansas production. Again, Gregg has broken this out by region and is covering the major crops. Among them would be wheat, corn, soybeans, alfalfa, cotton, grain sorghum, forage sorghum, sunflowers. Have a look at those budgets independently, see how they may fit your operation. And moreover, you're planning for your financial management here heading into another cropping go-round in 2022. As always, good work, Gregg. Looking forward to any updates you provide as the fundamentals might change within those budgets as we push forward. For now, many thanks for the overview right here.
All right, thanks.
An agricultural economist with K-State Research and Extension, Gregg Ibendahl. That series of budgets is to be posted again within the next couple of days on the agmanager.info website, producers. And we'll be back with more for you on Agriculture Today. Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and our opportunity once again to talk with Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation out of the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen. Roger, it is that time of the year where agricultural producers are thinking end-of-year tax planning. And there are certain business transactions that tend to take place this time of the year, one of which we'll look at today as per the producer, and that is the taxation of what we call prepaid farm expenses. And this is a strategy that's been around for a long, long while, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's a strategy that a lot of farmers utilize to prepay next year's input costs this year to get the deduction on this year's tax return. Of course, you can do that if you're a cash method farmer and you're buying inputs that you're actually going to use in the farming operation over the next 12 months. You can take the deduction in the year of payment rather than in the year that you actually use those inputs if you do it right.
That's the key, because there are stipulations, and there's been quite a bit of case law on this, as to what's a bona fide prepaid expense. And you say in an article that you just put out on this very topic that there are 3 conditions that must be met.
Yeah, the IRS actually put a revenue ruling out on this in 1979, and they laid out 3 conditions that have to be satisfied. You have to have a binding contract, and then you have to have a business purpose, and there cannot be a material distortion of income. And really, when it comes to business purpose, that's the easiest one of the 3 because, Eric, you can get just about any farmer 8 seconds and they can come up with a business purpose for just about anything that they do. So IRS really doesn't challenge that one. I can't say that I've ever seen a successful tax court case involving a challenge of prepaid expenses on lack of business purpose or argument by IRS. So that one we don't really worry about too much because it's pretty easy to show that you're entering into the transaction to lock in a supply, lock in a price that you think is going to be lower than what it would be about the inputs the next spring. So that's really not an issue. I think where the big problem is, and this is where the court cases are at, is on the issue of binding contract. You do have to have a binding written contract to buy actual inputs that you're going to use in your farming operation in the next year. That's absolutely critical.
Then what defines a binding contract?
Well, it has to be a contract for specifically identifiable goods. So you need to have a specific quantity. You need to have a contract that says that you don't have a right to a refund of any unapplied credit, because if you do that, that's indicative of that all you've done is make a deposit. Because what you cannot do is substitute other goods or services for those that are indicated in the purchase contract. That also indicates a deposit. So that means you just simply can't go to the co-op late in the year, say in December, and tell the co-op manager, here's a check for $25,000 or $200,000, whatever the case might be, for inputs that I'm going to come back in the spring and pick up, and have the elevator credit it to your general supply account. And that's not going to work. And there was a rather prominent case out of Texas on that went to the Circuit Court of Appeals down there in 1982. And that's what the farmer did. He just wrote out a check late in the year and said, I'll be back in the spring to pick up that amount worth credited to his general supply account. And IRS challenges that and said, no, you don't get the deduction in that earlier year. You can get it the next year, but not that year. And so they hit him with, deficiency and penalties associated with the deficiency. And the court agreed with the IRS and said, for all we know, you could have been buying $25,000 worth of non-deductible dog food. Mm-hmm. You've got to have a written binding contract for specific goods that you're going to use in your farming business over the next 12 months, and not retain any right to substitute other goods or services for those that are specified in the contract.
Now, you bring up in the article that there is an interesting twist to this. That transaction could show up on the seller's books as a deposit and still be a viable prepaid expense for the buyer's income tax concerns.
Yeah, there is a regulation under the tax code in the Treasury regulations that allows the seller to treat the transaction as a deposit without affecting the buyer's ability to deduct the amount of the prepaid expenses. So that's not that big of an issue because the buyer can treat it that way on their books. But that's in spite of the IRS still thinking that how the seller the inputs characterizes the transactions on their books matters. But no, there is a regulation that says that that's not as material as some IRS agents think it might be.
So again, binding contract, as you mentioned, the business purpose. Then there's the third definer, if you will, the material distortion of income. That sounds rather subjective. How is that determined? Exactly.
Well, this one is pretty mushy. It is subjective. The key is whether a distortion is material. But you see, when you do pre-purchase inputs, pre-purchase and deduct, what you are doing is distorting your income, your taxable income. So you can do that, but the question is, how far can you push the envelope until it becomes a material distortion? And there's really no bright line test to determine whether income has been materially distorted in any particular case. But what the IRS looks at, what they look for, Eric, are patterns of pre-purchases and deductions over a period of time. And if they see a tandem relationship between the level of pre-purchases and the level of income over several years, then they kind of get upset about that. In other words, if your income is high and in that year your pre-purchases go up and then your income drops and your pre-purchases drop in that year, because you don't need as much of an offsetting deduction, then they can raise an argument that that's a material distortion of income. But again, I really don't see hardly any cases on the material distortion of income issue. There are a few out there, but there's just not very many. Where the cases are at are on that binding contract issue.
But that material distortion of income doesn't so much relate to the amount of income variability here. It's that pattern that's the most critical.
Yeah, it's the pattern and the relationship of the purchase size to prior purchases and the time of year that the payment was made. So basically what I tell farmers is, and tell their tax practitioners is, it's important for a farmer to stay consistent with their customary business practices in buying supplies and the business purposes for the prepayment. If you bought X as an input size and you're farming the same amount of acreage the next year, then buy X as your inputs the next year. keep that relationship consistent from year to year, and that's going to avoid a material distortion of income argument by the IRS. And make sure that the prepayment transaction doesn't provide a tax benefit that extends longer than 12 months, because there's a specific regulation on that. It applies for inputs that you're going to use in the farming operation, so seed, feed, fertilizer, over the next 12 months. Don't push it beyond that.
And there is a cap on how much can be deducted for prepaid expenses in a given tax filing, you say.
Yeah, it's 50% of the total deductible farming expenses, not counting the prepaid. So in other words, if I have total deductible farming expenses of $500,000 for the tax year at issue, then I can, not counting the prepaid, then I can prepay and deduct up to $250,000 for that year. So it's 50% of your total deductible farming expenses, not counting the prepaid, which sets the cap on how much you can prepay and deduct. And that's largely drawn right off of Schedule F, including current year depreciation expense. So just take into account all your expenses, and then you're eligible to deduct up to 50% of that on a prepaid basis. Now, there's a major exception to that, and that is unforeseen circumstances. So if you have a change in your business operations caused by unforeseen or extraordinary circumstances, then you can go past the 50% limitation. I've seen IRS bless high levels of pre-purchases in years where you've had weather disasters, you might have high casualty losses, or you have a major change in federal farm programs. That can cause a major change in your business that would cause your prepaids to go up, and they'll let you go beyond the 50% limitation.
Well, given circumstances out in the countryside right now, there may be financial incentive and other incentive for producers to lock in these prepaid expenses. But before they do so, a conversation with their tax preparer probably would be a wise idea, would it not?
Well, conversation with their tax preparer and conversation with their input supplier or suppliers. What I'm hearing, I'm in the middle of the tax schools for K-State across the state right now, and what I'm hearing is that farmers are having trouble entering into these pre-purchase contracts because some of the suppliers are feeling a crunch about the possibility of not having the inputs that they normally would have to sell in the spring because of supply chain problems. So there may be some issues in being able to pre-purchase the amount that you want to pre-purchase and that you normally would pre-purchase in a year. So you need to talk with the suppliers, but definitely talk with your tax professionals too to make sure that, one, you've got a qualified contract. Your contract is written correctly. Secondly, that you have properly denoted your business purpose. And then third, you're trying to pre-purchase consistent with what your pre-purchases and deductions have been in the prior years.
And a further recommendation, read the article that Roger has authored on this topic, the tax rules involving prepaid farm expenses. That is in his blog series at washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. We'll talk again soon, Roger. Many thanks to you.
Thank you, Eric.
From the Washburn University School of Law, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation there, Roger McEowen, a regular contributor here on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
Our state, Kansas, is one of the states which has no star.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
I had to find a place where it could overwinter some of the many potted plants which decorate the deck and front entrance in summertime. The geraniums all went inside, mainly in my study. The caladiums I stacked in the workshop against the wall of the fireplace. They are in pots and really don't need any attention during the cold months, except don't freeze. The funny part is I had to clear that location of 2 boxes filled with books I should have taken to the dusty bookshelf to recycle. I will never read them again. But I did save 2 books from the 2 large carton boxes. One is an issue of National Geographic. It's a special edition titled Water, the Power, the Promise, and Turmoil of North America's Fresh Water. But the book I really held in my hands was America's National Monuments and Historic Sites, printed in 1960. I've no clue how that book got in one of the boxes, but I must have done it. I'm glad I saved it. There's a map in front which marks historic sites with a star. In front is written in my handwriting, February 4, 1961, with love from Anneke, Gus, Guido, and Telina. It was 1961 and must have been a gift to my parents to share our experiences and the beauty of this country. 3 of the children were not yet born. Having recovered the book, I've studied the maps, noticing the sites. The East Coast and the Southern Rockies have the most stars. There's much to be seen. Nearly every state but a few has at least 1 or 2 stars. Our state, Kansas, is one of the states which has no star, none at all. Now remember, the book was written in 1960. But sure, we should have had something to share and show people. Is not the Eisenhower boyhood home in Abilene a sight to mention? Eisenhower, the man who had to decide when to send thousands to their death, soldiers and French citizens. What about our trails, the Santa Fe and Oregon Trail, which run through our state? I'm surprised and disappointed, but it is a reminder and shows us again that we, Kansans, have to take the time to show our state. As I flip the pages and study the photographs, I'm thankful that many photos I recognize as having been there. I could say, been there, done that. But that's not the right way to look at it, and surely not where we live. I'm tempted to place a star where our farm is located in Pottawatomie County. That would be 1 star for Kansas. The other day, a friend and I cut dead firewood, good locust. We enjoyed the fall colors, saw a murder of crows, and watched turkeys on the land. We saw the lightfall change. It was beautiful. And today, there's Little Jerusalem, Badlands State Park in Logan County, out west. We're gaining.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. That'll do it for our Wednesday edition. Thanks, as always, for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.